do is we're going to continue to expound on our conversation regarding essentially the most basic concepts of location theory. So far in the course, what we've established is some of the basic economics regarding locational decisions, primarily by businesses. That's been our main focus. As we go into further in the semester, we will certainly expound upon the more residential choice space that we see as well. But we're really focused on the industrial side of things, the business side of things, because in reality, historically speaking, at least, that is what has also driven those residential choices as well. In market-based economic systems, people live where the jobs are, and so these locational decisions being made by firms ultimately end up defining to some extent where people live as well. Although that evolution, there's been some evolution in that space as well. So what we've established so far in the course is a general look at what we might call the primary sector view. And the primary sector view is a way of thinking about spatial orientation, primarily with respect to a single urban center and a conversation about how that urban center is facilitated with economic resources. And this harkens back to von Thunen's land rent value model, which helps to explain the dispersion of different types of resource locations. Primarily, his theory dealt with agricultural resources, but we can also think about applying the land rent value model to just a general conversation regarding resources. So we can even extend the conversation to other types of natural resources like the location of fresh water and so on and so forth. The big thing with von Thunen's theory, which is somewhat carries over to what we're going to talk about in this video, is this idea that transportation costs are a huge part of the spatial concentration, the spatial dispersion of businesses and the different aspects of businesses. One thing you got to keep in mind here is that as we move into more modern conversations regarding these topics, we're also moving into more complicated supply chains. 200 or 300 years ago, even though we had what was arguably called supply chains, nowadays those are far more complex, far more convoluted, not just in terms of the goods that we've always consumed. For example, if we look at something like agriculture, the agriculture supply chain today is much more complicated than it was 200 or 300 years ago, but also because we consume goods themselves that are far more complicated than we used to in terms of technology. And so therefore the conversation regarding raw materials and the conversation regarding processing or manufacturing technically complex products, it makes that supply chain bigger. And as that supply chain gets bigger, all of the choices being made within the scope of that supply chain then therefore have obvious effects on the locational decisions of firms. But what we're going to get into in this particular video is we're going to get into kind of the bridge between kind of von Thunen's very kind of agrarian land rent value model and a more modern take. So we're kind of moving into modernity here, but we're going to focus on in this particular video is Alfred Weber's least cost theory of locational decisions. And so what this does is it starts to get us into conversations about, again, more complex products. So we're not just talking about transporting apples or transporting potatoes or bringing water in. Now we're talking about moving about the economic system, what can be fairly complex products. So, for example, if we consider automobile themselves, right? Automobiles begin by being a set of very dispersed raw material. Extraction sites. So you have the extraction of raw materials such as rubber, such as steel, rare earth elements in the context of computer components that are put in automobiles. And then, of course, you have the processing and manufacturing of automobiles, where all of those raw materials are brought together and actually manufactured. And sometimes that occurs in multiple plants. So you might put together the chassis of a car in one location and then ship those chassis to another location for final assembly. In fact, that's fairly common these days. And then, of course, beyond the actual assembly of the automobile, then there's the distribution of the automobile to where it's actually purchased and sold. So that can be a very complex process. And one of the things that we're going to get into today is the conversation about, what is the characteristic difference of the products in question, from the raw material extraction to the processing, the manufacturing of the product, and then the shipment of that product to a retail space. What goes on there in the middle, and then how does that eventually dictate the spatial orientation that we see, not just within a given region or within a given country, but of course within a given globe. And so we're going to go through a lot of examples in this video later on, where we talk about very specific instances of some of these particular issues. So moving beyond that primary sector kind of analysis, what we're going to move into now is what is referred to as secondary sector. This is a broader scope of the economic system, where now, instead of just simply looking at the way in which urban centers are facilitated by economic resources, now we're broadening our conversation, and we're looking at those instances where there are multiple points of processing, there are multiple points of raw material extraction, and then also multiple points of retail distribution. And so it's kind of going from like the primary kind of primal view of economic systems that we see with respect to von Thunen's land rent, which is just kind of how do we organize economic activity around a single urban center. And then the secondary sector analysis is more like, well, how does this get organized everywhere? And why is it organized in this particular way? One of the important issues here that we've talked about quite a bit already is this idea of time space, and specifically this notion of time space compression. So over time, we've seen improved transportation and communication, which has drastically aided in the diffusion of goods and services around the globe. Diffusion just means getting into more locations, and so that diffusion creates economic opportunities. It creates opportunities for businesses to increase profits, or just generally to maximize profits. But in doing so, in that diffusion of goods and services and ideas, of course, what we have is crucial locational decisions. And then again, what we have to keep in mind here is that you could relegate this conversation to just talking about locational decisions of a factory, or locational decisions of a retail space. But ultimately, these locational decisions then spill over into other decisions that are being made, like residential decisions, infrastructure decisions, policy decisions, so on and so forth. So you can think about locational decisions of firms as having gravity. And when a location in a particular place is established, that area has relative gravity, which then warps the decision space around that particular location. And so, where we build roads, and where we build canals, and where we build schools and universities, and so on and so forth, this is in part driven by these early locational decisions. Another thing you have to understand too is that there's a persistence to this. If you look at the United States, we go to new places, and we go to places that have yet to be established at times. But generally speaking, economic activity has evolved within the same places that they were established historically, right? So New York City has been, the most important economic system in the U.S. for, a long time, and that's not likely to change anytime soon. So there's a real persistence in this as well, and that'll be something that we spend a lot of time talking about, in sort of the immediately following section, when we get into Paul Krugman's what we refer to as kind of the new economic geography, which Paul Krugman was largely developed, in which that sort of persistence becomes very important, because there's a persistence in like good economic things, and there's also a persistence in bad economic things. And so that leads to this idea of uneven development, which poses real social costs, and also affects policy decisions made. So, where we locate ourselves, in terms of locational decisions of firms, has impacts not only on the firm's profits, but has real effect on society. And so this is a really important conversation to be having. So, like I said, primarily what we're going to talk about in this video is Alfred Weber's what he referred to as least cost theory of firm locational decisions, and then really motivates a conversation about something referred to as agglomeration economies. So in Weber's theory, what matters? Well, three things matter: labor cost, transportation cost, and then agglomeration. So if you look at this over the sort of relatively recent history from industrial revolution and on into today, we see an evolution in kind of what seems to matter the most. And so early on in the Industrial Revolution, it was really transportation cost and these kind of agglomeration economies that seemed to be the main source of the dynamic choices being made. When globalization first started to occur, sort of primarily in post-World War II, that's when globalization really started to take off. We see that labor cost starts to now be a more important component, and this is, of course, one of the reasons why we see a lot of manufacturing in the U.S. being sent overseas to take advantage of those labor costs. But like I mentioned in class, we also see for example, automotive manufacturing in the U.S., which was primarily in the north and centered around Ohio and Michigan. We see those locational decisions now moving south as well to also take advantage of lower labor costs. So it's not just simply going overseas to take advantage of lower labor costs, but it's also within countries as well. We see that same dynamic. And then what I might refer to as kind of the modern or globalization part deux, what we're in right now, all three are going on. Labor costs matter, transportation costs matter, agglomeration economies matter. And so I think in many respects, there's a real vindication of Weber's theory of least cost, because while over time certain attributes might be accentuated more than others, and Weber himself, when he was talking about his theory and developing his theory, he was pretty adamant that transportation cost was the most important thing. But even that has evolved over time. So the general sort of setup to Weber's least cost theory is generally a neoclassical economic model. So the assumptions are very similar to what you would see in a neoclassical setup. So firms are assumed to be profit maximizers, where profits are just total revenues minus total cost. The goal of businesses is to improve competitive advantages. They want to increase market share. So that's kind of a unique modern phenomena, is the sort of goal of businesses to not only grow profits but also to grow market share. And so you can grow profits without growing market share if you're reducing cost, right? But if you reduce your cost and you take advantage of competitive advantages, specifically issues related to distance as friction. So this is something that we've been talking about in class for the last few class periods, this idea that distance represents friction in the spatial concentration of firm locational decisions. And so firms try to take advantage of reducing those frictions within their own supply chain in ways that make them more efficient than their competitors. A really good example of this is Walmart. Walmart was a small, relatively insignificant department store chain in the 70s. And then in the 80s and the 90s, especially in the 90s and into the early 2000s, Walmart took great advantage of reducing their issues with respect to distance. So Walmart was one of the first sort of department store chains that really put a huge focus on the efficient locational decisions of their distribution centers. And so they put their distribution centers in places where their storefronts had relatively easy, cheap access to the distribution centers, and that those distribution centers were primarily located in places where the infrastructure itself was also efficient, so that they could get those goods to the actual retail storefronts. And then the other thing that Walmart did is they really focused on this concept called lean supply chain. Lean supply chain means that they tried to reduce as much as they could inventory costs within their retail space. So they would actually try to limit the amount of products they had in their store. And then when people bought products, they created an extremely efficient system that when you scanned a product in the store, it sent a message to the distribution center basically saying, okay, someone bought, a particular product. We need to make sure that we're replacing that in the storefront. And again, by putting those distribution centers in fairly efficient locations that could get to the retail space quickly, what this did is it allowed Walmart to reduce their inventory costs. So they reduced their costs, and they were able to take advantage of these spatial frictions that other companies simply were not able to. And so that's a big reason why Walmart exploded. And I don't know if this is true today, but I know that as early as 15 years ago, Walmart was the largest retailer in the world. I think that they have since been taken over by Amazon, and Amazon, of course, is a really interesting case study in all this as well. One of the big things, or perhaps the biggest thing that Weber suggested, is that what firms do in order to maximize their profits is they try to reduce variable cost over time. To him, variable cost was the important focus, because variable costs included things like labor and transportation. And again, remember, transportation was the most important thing to Weber, but also energy usage as well, right? The amount of energy needed to keep a supply chain going. So there was all these efficiencies that businesses are trying to take advantage of, and what Weber argued was that this was mostly about reducing variable costs. And I think if you look at the spatial dispersion of locational decisions in the U.S. as well as globally, like I said, despite the fact that this was an idea, excuse me, that was developed a long time ago, we see a lot of what we would expect to see if we applied